If a father shows up after 15 years with a drug deal instead of an apology, what exactly are you supposed to feel? Because the real wound is not always abandonment, it is the moment you realize survival became so normal that you stopped noticing what it cost you. And when that same story leads all the way to a suicide attempt, you have to ask whether the collapse started with fame or long before anyone was even looking. Let's get into the conversation. Wait, he actually said the 6th of November 2020 was the day he tried to kill himself. That is a brutal sentence to just hang there like that. And what hit me first was how early the pressure started, not the fame. The dad gone, the mom young, the estate, the school violence, all of it stacks up. Childhood did not exactly come with a support package here. What got me is how he says not having a father became normal. That line is kind of sad in a quiet way. When survival becomes normal, you do not even realize what got stolen from you. And then the first father meeting is basically, hey, help me move some drugs. 15 years later, that is your opening line? Imagine hoping for a father and getting a business proposal from the underworld. But I also get his weird restraint, because he does not go cartoon villain on him. He is saying, I did not know him enough to reduce him to one label. That is actually more painful than hatred sometimes. The part where he says he had supportive male role models and his dad missed the memo is wild. Like the universe was testing him with the worst possible version of reconciliation. And then the resentment is not just about drugs, it is about choosing not to connect. That feels like the deeper wound, honestly. The crazy thing is he still leaves room for grief after the death. Like the pain does not disappear just because the person is gone. People love acting like death edits the whole story into something noble. It usually just makes the unfinished business louder. And then school sounds like a battlefield, not a classroom. He is not scared of learning. He is scared of the walk between lessons. That is such a nasty way to grow up, just negotiating the playground like a war zone. And the awful part is, he is trying to answer correctly while also thinking about getting beaten up later. That changes what shyness means too, right? It is not personality, it is strategy. The long way home as a life philosophy is insane, but it is survival, not drama. And then magic comes in almost accidentally through his grandfather. Not as destiny, not as enlightenment, just a guy showing tricks to a kid who is getting bullied. That is what I like about it, though, because it was utility first. It gave him attention in a way that was controlled. Better to be known as the magic kid than the kid getting wrecked on the way home. That is a terrible marketing strategy, but a very effective one. And there is something huge in that idea that belonging can come from craft. But he also hints at the trap because then the craft becomes identity, which is where the whole story starts getting scary. Because if you are the magic person, what happens when the magic stops? That is the real question underneath all this success. And then Crohn's disease hits at 13, which is just another body blow. Not metaphorically, literally a body thing on top of everything else. He describes it like an open wound inside the stomach, which is horrifying. And then stress can flare it up, so the mind and body are basically arguing all day. That is a horrible combination for anyone, let alone a teenager trying to feel normal. Also, the shame around it matters because nobody wants to talk about bowel disease as a teen. Teenagers can barely say the word feelings, let alone digestion. Seriously, this is the least glamorous origin story imaginable. But it explains why performance becomes more than performance. It is not just a career, it is a way to outrun the body. And then losing the ability to hold cards because his body is deteriorating must have felt like theft. Like the one thing that made him feel powerful starts slipping out of his hands. That is how identity crises get vicious, because your best self is also your job. I keep thinking about that name dispute too. Losing the right to use your own stage name is not a small legal thing. It is personal erasure. Imagine building a whole universe and then someone says, actually, you cannot use your own sign on the door. That would mess with anybody's head. And he says the Dynamo had to die, which is such a wild line. That sounds like grief and rebirth in the same breath. But maybe it is also a strange kind of honesty. Because if the persona is carrying all the pain, eventually it collapses. Do you think the success made the collapse worse? I think success can delay the breakdown by making everybody clap while you are bleeding. That is disgustingly accurate. The applause can become anesthesia. And once that fades, you are left alone with the actual person. Which is probably why this episode feels so heavy even before the bigger career stuff. He is basically saying magic was hope, survival, fame, and then eventually a mirror. And mirrors are ruthless when the identity starts cracking, especially when the person in it is asking, who am I without this? That question is going to keep coming back, I feel like. And we are still only in the setup, which is insane because the setup already sounds like a whole movie. I also love that he does not romanticize any of it. He keeps saying it was painful, confusing, and sometimes just ugly. The honest version usually is uglier than the highlight reel. But that is why it lands. If anything, this makes the future part more interesting, not less. Because now the question is not just how he got famous, but what fame did to the wounds underneath. And whether the thing that saved him also cornered him. That is the kind of story that stays with you. All right, I think we need to keep going because the next part is clearly where it gets even messier. I want to hear how the rise starts turning into pressure. Episode 2 is where the spotlight starts biting back, and the body, the name, and the career all start fighting. The brutal part is he did not just lose a career, he lost a self. That is way more destabilizing than people admit. Everyone talks about the tricks, not the identity collapse underneath. And the name thing alone is insane. Imagine becoming a legend and then being told your own name is off limits. That is not a legal issue, that is an existential prank. And the scary thing is how early the fractures start. Bradford was not just hard, it was constantly on him. Father gone, racism, violence, and then school every day. That is not childhood, that is survival mode with homework. I keep coming back to how normal abandonment became for him. When your dad disappears at 4, your brain just rewires around absence. That is the part that hurts, because he almost sounds numb to it. Which is a defense, obviously, but still. Then he meets the father again, and it is instantly disappointing. Not even a warm reunion, just a business proposal with drugs. Nothing says family healing like, can your friends help me shift some stuff? That is such a sharp betrayal because he was finally open to connection. And the dad reaches for the worst possible version of himself. You can feel the moment the hope just dies. But I also get why he did not go full rage there. He had already built a whole new support system around positive men. That youth center stuff matters so much more than people think. It is not abstract mentorship, it is replacement structure. Basically, someone finally showed up with better options than chaos. And then the magic comes in as protection first, art second. That detail is huge because people romanticize talent too much. Sometimes the craft is just camouflage before it becomes destiny. The granddad almost sounds like the coolest guy in the room, but also the only one making him feel seen. And once the tricks got him attention, the whole thing changed shape. Because now it is no longer only self-defense. It becomes belonging, status, identity, all of it at once. Which is why losing it later hits like a personal death. He literally says the Dynamo needed to die. That is not drama, that is somebody describing a split in the psyche. And the body stuff makes it even more unforgiving. Crohn's disease at 13 is already a war. Especially when you are still trying to figure out who you are. People hear illness and think inconvenience, not daily degradation. He is talking about pain, mobility, stress, and shame all together. And he had surgery as a teenager. That kind of thing changes your relationship with your body forever. I actually think this is where his story gets intellectually interesting. Because the same body that made magic possible also kept failing him. So even his superpower had an expiry date. That is dark, but yes, exactly. And then the fame chapter makes everything look clean from the outside. Super Bowl, TV show, awards, the whole rocket ship. People love a rise because it lets them ignore the bill. The bill is always there, just invisible until the collapse. And for him, the collapse is not just burnout. It is illness, grief, legal loss, and then the name disappears too. The grandmother passing is another quiet gut punch in there. The person who believed in you the most is gone right when you need anchoring. That kind of grief does not sit still, it mutates. Then you add the legal dispute and it gets almost cruelly symbolic. You are sick, grieving, and now you cannot even be yourself professionally. No wonder he hit a point where disappearing felt logical. That line is horrible, but you hear how isolated he felt. What gets me is he does not frame it as one single villain. It is cumulative damage, layer after layer. Life was basically running a hostile takeover. That is annoyingly accurate. And still, he keeps coming back to hope, which is the most human part. Not optimism, hope, which is more fragile and more stubborn. He is trying to reconnect with magic, not just perform it. That distinction matters because the audience only knew the output. They did not know the scaffolding holding it up, or how much of that scaffolding was just pain he learned to weaponize. I think that is why this story lands so hard. It is not about fame going wrong, it is about survival succeeding too well. Wait, that is actually a wild way to put it. He survived so effectively that everyone forgot the emergency never ended. Yeah, and now the emergency is asking for a new name and a new life, which is a lot for one person to carry. The next question is what happens when the stage stops protecting him. Because if magic was the shield, losing access to it is terrifying. And if the body keeps failing, there is nowhere to hide. That is the ugly center of the story, really. Who are you when the crowd, the name, and the trick all go quiet? That is what episode 2 has to deal with. Because this chapter has already done enough damage for one day. Exactly, let the next one bring the chaos. We are getting to the part where the spotlight starts biting back. And that is where the real unraveling begins. Because once the body starts breaking, the whole illusion gets expensive. He was never just losing tricks, he was losing the machine that made him feel real. And that is a terrifying sentence for anyone with a public name. Especially when the name is the thing people love before they love the person. Right, and then the room asks why he did not just bounce back. As if trauma and Crohn's disease are a bad afternoon you sleep off. People always talk about reinvention like it is branding. But for him it sounds like survival, not marketing. That is the part that gets me because he did not get to be light about it. He had to become magic before he ever got to enjoy magic. And that is why the childhood stuff matters so much. The father disappearing, the bullying, the racial abuse, the fear on the way to school. That is not background noise, that is the whole wiring of the mind. And he says the school part was not even about learning, it was about surviving the day. Imagine trying to do fractions while also trying not to get jumped. Honestly, that is not an educational setting, that is a stress factory. And then the river story is just savage. They invited him out there just to throw him in because he could not swim. That is the kind of cruelty that teaches a kid the world is unsafe. Then one good swimmer pulls him out, and that becomes its own kind of memory. Which is probably why he remembers the helpers so clearly. The brain keeps the rescue because it needs somewhere to put the hope. And then magic shows up as the first thing that changes the social equation. That is such a wild pivot because most people think of magic as entertainment first. For him it was camouflage, leverage, and identity all at once. Bro turned card tricks into social armor. That is one of the most British superhero origin stories imaginable. And the funny thing is, that accidental path is what made it authentic. He did not chase belonging through magic, he stumbled into it. And once people reacted to him differently, he probably realized he had a place. That can become addictive so fast. Because if the applause is the first time you feel safe, you keep chasing it. Then one day you are not asking what you do, you are asking who you are without it. And that question hits even harder once the name gets stripped away. Losing the rights to your own stage name is insane. That is not just a legal issue, that is an identity attack. Imagine someone suing your soul and winning on paperwork. That is so cold, but also exactly what it felt like. Because the public only sees the celebrity version, not the person getting hollowed out. And the shocking part is how much he kept carrying in silence. Illness, grief, family history, legal war all at once. No one gets to stack that much pain and stay elegant forever. That line where he says the Dynamo needed to die is brutal. Not dramatic, just brutal. Because he is basically saying the persona stopped being protection. It became a burden he could not carry anymore. And then the suicide attempt in 2020 just reframes everything. Suddenly, all the earlier success looks different. Like, wait, this was happening while everyone thought he had made it. That gap between the public story and the private story is the real tragedy. And it is why fame is such a lousy synonym for happiness. The crowd cannot see your internal operating system crashing. They just see the close-up trick and assume the man is fine. His relationship with his dad is another huge fracture line. The first reunion is almost painful to even hear about. 15 years gone, and the first ask is about moving drugs. That is such a gut punch, because part of him clearly wanted a father, not a transaction. And he is still fair enough to admit that his dad was not just a cartoon villain. That honesty actually makes the story hit harder, because it leaves room for love and damage to exist together. Human beings are annoyingly complicated like that. Annoyingly is doing so much work there. But that is what makes the resentment believable. He did not just lose a father, he lost the chance to be chosen by one. That can stay in a person for decades. And then the mother angle adds another layer because she was so young too. A teenage mom trying to raise a kid in chaos is not a simple setup. Nobody in that house was getting the easy version of life. Which is why the blame game feels stupid here. It is more like everybody inherited damage and tried to survive it. Even the Crohn's diagnosis feels emotionally loaded, not just medically loaded. Being taken to hospital as a kid to figure out what is wrong with you is heavy, especially when you already feel like you do not belong. Suddenly, the body becomes another place where you are told you are broken. And for a teenager, that can become identity poison. You are not just sick, you are different, and different gets weaponized. Then you add the pain, the mobility issues, the stress flare-ups. It is not one thing, it is a whole system wearing him down. And that is why the old dream of performing becomes more than a dream. It becomes proof that he can still do something incredible. But also, the body keeps negotiating with the dream. That negotiation sounds exhausting. Crohn's disease really said, "Let me ruin the magic show." That is dark, but unfortunately accurate. What I keep coming back to is how much of this story is about containment. He is containing fear, pain, rage, shame, and ambition all at once. That is not sustainable for anybody. Eventually, something cracks. And for him, the crack was not a moment, it was a collapse. That is why the rebuild matters so much. Not because he can just go back to being Dynamo, but because he cannot. He has to find a way to be Steven without losing the art. That is the real cliff edge. Also, if you think about it, his whole life has been one long escape act. Escape from the estate, escape from bullying, escape from illness, escape from the name. And now he has to escape the escape act. That is annoyingly good. It almost makes you wonder if the public success was ever enough for the private cost. From this chapter, the answer looks like no. But the fact he is still here changes everything. That alone deserves respect. All right, we have sat in the wreckage long enough. Episode 2 has to deal with what happens after the fall. Because that is where the rebuilding either gets real or gets ugly. And knowing this story, it is probably both. Come back for that, because the next part goes even deeper. The wild part is how early the loneliness starts. Like 4 years old and your father is already gone. That becomes your normal before you even know what normal is. And then magic shows up like the first thing that actually gives you leverage. Not fame, not money, just one trick and suddenly people look at you differently. That is such a heavy origin for a performer. Because he is not saying, "I loved magic first." He is saying, "I needed somewhere to put the pain." That is the part that hits me the most. The craft is almost an emergency exit before it becomes a career. Which is insane because everyone else sees the glitter and thinks it was destiny. Destiny is such a cute word for survival. And the school stuff is brutal because it is not just bullying, it is constant vigilance. Imagine being a kid and planning your whole day around not getting hit. That is not education, that is threat management. Taking the long way home because the short way home has a beatdown waiting. And the weird thing is, he still says he liked learning. So the mind wants growth while the body is trying to stay safe. That split is probably where a lot of his later identity pain comes from. And then the father comes back offering drugs. Bro, if you write that in a script, people say it is too on the nose. But it matters that he does not simplify him into a villain either. He keeps saying maybe the man was damaged too. That is the adult answer, not the kid answer. The kid answer is, you had one shot to be my father, and you fumbled it. And you brought customer acquisition to the reunion. Exactly, the first father-son bonding exercise is illegal side quests. But that is where the resentment makes sense. It is not only abandonment, it is betrayal of the one opening to connect. And then the man dies, so the grief gets trapped with the anger. That is awful to carry because there is no clean ending. The childhood violence is another layer, though. The river story is savage. They threw him into a dam knowing he could not swim. That is not a prank, that is cruelty. And the rescue mattered because one person interrupting trauma can change a whole life. One adult, one older kid, one decent human being, that is enough sometimes. That feels like the pattern of this whole story. One person opens a door, and he uses it to build a future. His grandfather showing him magic is such a cinematic pivot. Old man says, "I have a trick," and accidentally saves a life. But even there, he is worried about being seen as weird, which is so honest because kids do not want another reason to get targeted. Magic is cool later, but as a kid, it can just be another label. And then it flips into armor. Not only armor, a spotlight. He turns the thing meant to mark him as odd into the thing that protects him. That is actually a genius survival move. And then Crohn's disease enters, which is another kind of body betrayal. Honestly, the body keeps taking side quests nobody asked for. I cannot imagine being a teenager and hearing, "Your inside is broken." That can mess with your sense of worth fast, especially when you already feel like the outsider. And then later the success comes, and everybody thinks the story is just a scent. Super Bowl, TV show, awards, applause, easy life, right? Yeah, because external success always fixes internal damage. That is the lie people sell about people like him. When he says magic could not fix me, that line is devastating. Because he is admitting the identity that saved him also could not save him forever. That is where the title of the whole thing starts to sting. Becoming someone else can save you until it starts eating you. And that 2020 moment, the rock bottom, feels less sudden in context. It feels like years of accumulated pressure finally snapping. The frightening part is how many people are one invisible crisis away from that. And he is finally saying it out loud, which takes guts. No, it really does. You can tell this is not polished PR trauma. It is messy, contradictory, and human. That is why it lands. All right, we have to stop there before we turn this into a eulogy for stage names, which, to be fair, would be a very weird episode. Episode 2 is where the collapse starts asking for a rebuild. And that is where things get even more interesting. Come back for that, because the next part goes deeper.